Hello and welcome to this episode of the Together We Rise Summit. And I'm excited to have our next speaker here. It's the wonderful Robyn Dalzen. Robyn, thank you so much for joining us.
Hello, it's so great to be here with you.
Thank you so much for getting up in your morning time to have this conversation. So for those of you who haven't met Robyn before, I'd love to head over to her bio to introduce her. So Robyn is a consent educator and a somatic sex and intimacy coach. She's passionate about helping people find what brings them joy in their body and in their life. Robyn works at the intersection of mindfulness, consent, embodiment, and sexuality, guiding people to slow down and bring awareness to what they desire, practice the skills to communicate those desires, and create clear agreements to receive exactly what they want. She is co-founder of the School of Consent with Dr. Betty Martin, who created the Wheel of Consent. And she's certified as a transformational leadership coach, an embodied sex coach, a sexological body worker, a Wheel of Consent facilitator, and attention and trauma releasing exercises, TRE, provider. Oof, you've done so much. Oh, thank you so much for being here and for bringing this. I've known you for quite a few years. We've been kind of moving in the same circles, and I love the work that you've been bringing forwards through the Wheel of Consent and the depth which you've gone to in that work. And I'm curious about this in relationship to facilitation. So our audience are people who are facilitators, who want to be facilitators, or people who are just like super curious about the topics that we're talking about. And how do you see consent? How do you see that kind of informs facilitation? I know that's a really big question.
Yeah, well, and it's as a consent educator, it is what I teach.
Mm.
So my workshops are about consent and teaching consent. And there are elements of consent woven throughout the training and how it's taught. And it's such an important part of facilitation, regardless of
Mm.
what you're teaching.
Mm.
And so it might be helpful to just define consent in the way that I think about it and apply it in the work that I do. A lot of people hear the word consent and think, oh, I have to ask before I touch someone. I
Mm.
need permission to do what I want to do. And it's easy to confine it to consent is included when I'm first meeting someone. It's included if we're having a sexual engagement, but consent is actually much broader than permission.
Mm.
And so another definition of consent is about the agreement and the agreement between two or more people about what may happen or what will not happen. And I would say the same applies within a group setting. So it's about the agreements we have with each other, how we're going to interact with each other, how we're going to relate. It's about getting clear when we have wants or needs or desires and being able to communicate that and giving someone else the space to notice and communicate their limits, their yes, their no, their availability, their willingness. And so it is this agreement field that is formed that allows us to interact with each other with clarity, with ease, with integrity.
Mm.
And so when you think about working with a group, facilitating, and that could be facilitating one-on-one or a bigger group of people. Consent comes in from the moment we step into the room. How are we interacting with each other? What are the agreements that we have within this space that we're going to inhabit together? And so I spend a lot of time in any workshop that I offer, setting the container, which includes our agreements for how we are going to interact with each other for the time that we're together. And that can be as simple as confidentiality to speaking from our own personal experience, respecting other people's pronouns and lived experience. That could include limits for how we're going to interact with each other. And that agreement setting process is such an important foundational piece for creating a sense of safety for each person in that space. And it is having that inner sense of safety. Like we can't create a space that is safe for everyone, but we can provide an environment that allows people to find that sense of safety for themselves. And it's having that sense of safety that allows people to step into the experience. It allows them to be in a learning space. And so that's one of the first points that feels so important, that is all about consent. It's all about setting that container with clear agreements for each body in that space to be able to feel safe enough to step in and try things and experiment and learn.
Thank you. You know, what I was kind of feeling in myself as you were talking into this was, you know, that this is a feeling experience, not a thinking experience, right? Mm. So we have this level of consent at the beginning of our experience so that our nervous systems can actually get on board with what's going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And without that kind of buy-in at a physiological level, then the possibility of transformation is limited, or perhaps it goes completely, because people just cannot step into the experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, within our nervous system, we are constantly sensing our environment. Am I safe? Am I not safe? Am I safe? Am I not safe? Is this place safe for me? Can I bring my whole self here? Can I speak in this environment? Can I share in this environment? Can I experience in this environment? All of that is happening in our nervous system. And so if we don't get those cues for our nervous system to settle, we actually can't learn.
Mm-hmm.
And we certainly can't be at choice. And so it's finding those ways to continually allow people to keep sensing into their body and to feel that sense of, okay, my nervous system can settle, I can be here, it's safe to be here. Mm-hmm. And it's not the container setting the agreements. It's not something that we do and then it's done and then we go and do whatever we want for the rest of the workshop. It's an ongoing process. And we talk about this in the world of consent as well. Consent is an ongoing process. It's an ongoing agreement. Mm-hmm. And so we don't just agree, yes, this is what we're doing together, and now let's jump in and forget all of those agreements. It's being able to turn back to, okay, what's happening now? How am I feeling now? Is there anything else that I need in order to feel safe here, in order to step in? And so it's also creating an environment where people can continue to address and talk about, oh, I'm noticing that there was actually something missing from the agreements that's not allowing me to be here. And to be able to bring that in. And it's also living those agreements. And so in the work that I facilitate, one of the core agreements is around participation and the ways to participate. And it's designed to honor people's choice, which is also part of the consent process. It's part of feeling safe, and it is essential to transformative experiences. And so we have an agreement that participation can look many ways. You are welcome to step into a practice and partner with someone if it's a dyad experience, or you're welcome to step out and journal or take a walk or take a nap. You're welcome to sit back and witness. And so we give lots of possibilities for participation. And this idea that participation is not limited to doing the thing that was offered in the way that it was offered, but actually noticing, how do I feel in this moment? Do I want to step in? Do I want to step out? And not feeling the pressure that in order to get something or in order to experience what I came here to learn, I have to do this activity that was offered. And so it's finding ways to infuse choice into the experience. And what happens in that is actually pretty magical. So what I hear people talking about is the ahas that come from exercising choice, not necessarily from doing the practices that were offered. And so when people choose to sit out of a practice, I'll often hear them say, wow, I've never done that before. I have never honored my body in that way. Say no when the authority in the room is offering this exercise, and to say no to that feels revolutionary. And then they get this experience in their body that, wow, I get to make choices for myself, and I get to honor what my body is telling me. And that's where the learning is. And so it's finding those ways to continue to bring in choice and possibilities for people to, it's like choose your own adventure. And making sure that those choice points are integrated throughout everything that you do. And that when we talk about an agreement around choice, we are not then having an expectation that people step in and do the practices the way that we offer them. So it's remaining flexible as the facilitator, and also being able to integrate, if this is a value that I want to bring into this space, how do I then honor that every step of the way?
And what I'm hearing you describe within this way of working with choice is that it offers inclusion. So instead of, well, these people here, you're going to join in, you want to join in, great. Well, the rest of you, well, you're not included because this feels like it's too much for you. But it's like there's this wider net of inclusion. That's what I'm hearing. It's like, oh, you want to sit out? That's okay. You're still part of the community. You still get to belong here, even if you choose to go for a walk, even if you choose to sit out, even if you choose to go and have a nap. You still get to belong here. And I think historically, being in these kind of transformational spaces for quite a long time now, there was so much pressure It was
Mhm.
either kind of do or die.
Yeah.
You either join in and you're part of the community, you're part of the tribe, you get to belong, or you don't. And you're out there on your own, trying to survive by yourself.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, and the pressure and the expectation to have a certain experience.
Yes.
And if you're not having that experience, you're not doing it right.
Yeah.
And it blows my mind when I think about spaces that I've been in where that was how it was framed. That was the expectation in the room and the
Mm,
pressure I put on myself to show
mm,
up in a particular way
mm.
that wasn't truly authentic.
Yeah.
And so if we want to live in a world where we are authentic
Mm,
and we honor people's sovereignty and and differences amongst ourselves, then we have to bring that same ethos into the spaces that we're holding and create multiple opportunities and multiple points of participation in those spaces.
I love that. Multiple points of participation.
Yeah. And what I've noticed my own process over the years when I first started facilitating, the pressure I put on myself to give people an experience.
Yes.
And it was like, okay, here's the exercise that we're going to do. And I know if they do this exercise, they're going to have these transformative experiences and they're going to think I'm amazing and I'm going to feel good about myself and they're going to feel good. And and it was a lot of pressure that I put on myself to perform, and a lot of pressure I put on my participants to show
Mm,
up in a way to make me feel good.
yeah.
And so noticing that part and really soothing that part and then this process of noticing, wow, there are so many different ways to learn in this environment, different ways to show up, different ways to participate. And there's so much more richness that comes from holding that perspective and providing the space for that to happen.
Mm,
Like I think there is so much to learn in the role of the witness and being able to witness others in an experience. I think is just as healing and as transformative as actually being in the experience yourself.
mm,
And how many opportunities do we have to be in that role of seeing something happening between people and and to be able to watch and learn from that experience. So one of the ways that I have shifted this in my workshops is an approach of inviting people to opt in to an experience rather than having people opt out of the experience.
mm, mhm, mm.
And it's subtle, but it's quite profound. And so the opt out way is assuming that everybody's going to do it.
Mm,
And it's against the norm to opt out. But if you need to sit out, that's okay. You can opt out if you want. So it's already putting pressure and expectation that the thing to do is to be in.
mm,
But when you reverse that and you assume that there's no expectation that everybody does this. In fact, if nobody wants to do it, we'll come up with something else. And so framing it as here's the practice that we're going to move into next, explaining it, giving a demo so people can see what it looks like, and then giving them the choice.
mm,
Here are the options. You can step in and do this practice with another person. You can sit out and witness. You can sit and journal and reflect on what we're sharing in this practice, or something else. And so take a moment to notice how you'd like to participate. And those moments of pause are an important part of that process of being able to notice themselves and to choose.
Mm.
So often we are jumping into experiences, and our body and our nervous system needs time to calibrate and to feel into. This is part of the, like, including our whole body in consent, to give that moment of pause, check in and notice how you'd like to participate.
Mm.
And so there's some time, and then there's some space. And then I'll say, if you would like to pair up with another person for this practice, I invite you to stand up. And so it's also an active stepping into. There's a mobilization that has to happen to go into the experience.
Yeah.
And so, people stand up, and then you can also offer space there. Okay, take a moment and look around and see who else is standing, who else wants to be in this practice. Take that in, and then notice if there's a person that you're drawn to that you'd like to do this with, and find another partner. And so each of these points of choice give people a little more space to feel into, to calibrate, before then moving into whatever practice is offered. And just that switch from, opt out if you don't want to do it, to actively opt in if you want, has made such a profound difference in this process of inviting people into choice, and the empowerment that comes from that process.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I'm just kind of feeling, I'm picturing this in my mind's eye of people like, yeah, wow, do I want to stand up? Do I want to opt in? Oh, I'm going to consider this. I'm going to take a moment to consider. I'm going to take a moment to feel. Yeah, hell yes, I want to step in. Or actually, no, I'm okay where I am right now. And or actually, I want to go and rest. It's almost like giving people those like moments to really come back home to themselves and not get swept away in the group momentum, which is how a lot of the groups I've been in historically operated. Everyone kind of got swept away in the kind of tidal wave of energy that was kind of moving towards something happening. Whereas this feels like it's coming from a much more truthful, aligned coherency. And it's giving people that, I'm guessing you're having to give people the skills to be able to read their bodies and to know what a yes actually feels like, and what a no feels like, and what a maybe feels like. Is that something you'd be interested in speaking into?
That's the first part of the workshop. Yeah, so being able to sense into our body and to notice what a yes feels like, what a no feels like, what a maybe feels like, is critical to choose. And so that's one of the first practices that I do in pretty much all of the consent-based workshops that I'm offering. There's some form of being in the practice of noticing a yes or a no, and a maybe as well. And so, oftentimes, and I'll start with a no, because for most people, no is harder to access. And in order to have an authentic yes, we have to have access to our no.
Yeah.
And so we open up with a no, and I'll invite people to walk around the space. I start first with an orientation to the space. So walking around, noticing the room that we're in, looking around, noticing the colors, the textures, the windows, the doors. So letting people's bodies orient to the space that they're in
Yeah.
as a way of settling, of grounding, and kind of being ready to step into experiences that may bring stuff up. So first, like, know the space that you're in. Notice something in the room that draws your attention. Notice something that feels good to you, that feels good to look at. And so finding these points of resource in the space. And then we'll shift into, find a place in the room where you feel good standing, where you've got enough space between you and other participants. Notice if you want a wall behind you for support. You could even stand with your back against the wall. Notice if it feels better to have more space on all sides of you. And so a lot of the invitations are to start noticing your body in relation to the space and in relation to other bodies.
Mm.
And then it's an invitation to bring a no into your awareness and notice what happens in your body as you connect to this word no.
Mm.
Notice any movement in your body. Notice temperature in your body, vibration in your body. It might be inviting people to reflect on an experience where they felt an authentic no, and something that's benign,
Mm.
uh, that isn't going to bring up a lot of charge. So I'll often refer to, I think of a food that you don't like to eat. Um, and and then it's, start practicing saying no out loud, saying no at different volumes or in different ways. Notice if your arms want to come out in front of you. And so there's this time to feel into a no in the body
Mm.
and taking some reflections. What's that like? How did that feel? What did you notice?
Mm.
And the noticings are so important. Um, Not only for myself, but for the participants in the room to really get a sense of the full range of experience. For some, no comes very easily. For some, they can't get the word no out of their mouth. For some, it brings up anger and rage. For some, it feels powerful and grounding. And what's important to me is for people to notice what is their personal no.
Yeah.
And so when you get that anchored in your body and you're clear on what are your access points, what information do you have from your body that you're a no? And and then noticing in other moments when maybe a no comes out of your mouth, does that actually match what you're feeling in your body from what you
Mm.
know of your no? How many times do we say no, but we're not feeling a no? Or how many times do we say yes, but we're feeling a no in our body? And so giving people that access to their most authentic expression when the words that come out are matching what we know to be true within us. And then we'll move into an experience of a yes. And I'll invite people to move around the space, find another space, kind of shake off the no, and then inviting a yes into their awareness and feeling what a yes feels like in the body, playing with saying it out loud, with volume, with movement. I've also experimented with then moving to a maybe.
Mm.
and giving space for the maybe. I think there's so much richness in the maybe space.
Mm.
So I think there's a lot of pressure to get to a yes or a no.
Mm-hmm.
And in that space of maybe, there's a lot to explore. And for some, either some requests or some people generally or particular moments, we need more time and space to find our yes and our no. And so in that space of maybe, it might be, I need more information to come to a clear yes or no. It might be, I need more time. And it just takes my body a little more time to get clear within myself. Or it might be, I'm actually a no, and there's some barrier that keeps me from being able to come to my no. And that might be a power dynamic, it might be a trauma response. So giving more time and space to be with the maybe and start to explore, what is it that keeps you from finding a clear expression of yes or no? And just in that practice of yes and no, these two words that are very simple words, but carry a lot of charge, a lot of meaning for us. And so by giving people this opportunity to start to attune to these words, to practice saying them out loud, can make it easier to then access their yes and no throughout the rest of the work that we're doing together.
I love it. I'm such a kind of this is what I love doing. I love supporting people to come into this relationship with themselves and to feel the data that's coming up from the body, to feel the sensations and to understand, what it's telling them.
Mm-hmm.
Is it telling me that I want to move towards or move away?
Mm-hmm.
Is it telling me that I want more of this or less than that? Is it telling me that I need to rest? What is it telling me? And so often, in our culture, we've been taught to kind of operate from here. And it's where all the shoulds come from. I should do this. I should do that. And where the trauma responses kind of come in and the patterns like around people pleasing, for example, which is completely overriding our own body. But because we've been kind of wired to we've been wired to believe that there's something wrong and we have to do something outside to ensure that connections remain safe. And so we please people, but at the detriment to our own well-being.
Mm-hmm.
And if we taught what you've just described in schools, right, to little kids, age 5 upwards, we would have such a different culture.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like that gets kind of taught out of children to have choice, to have agency. Like, no, you've got to sit here and you've got to do this thing. You've got to do as I say. All of that. We've been so conditioned into divorcing our bodies and
Mm-hmm.
operating purely on this kind of shoulding mentality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we should ourselves and we should each other.
So what you've described in this process is so foundational. It's like anyone who's listening to this, they might think, well, that sounds quite straightforward and simple, but actually the profundity of it,
Mm-hmm.
until you've been into that experience where you've really kind of explored, wow, can I connect with this information in my body? Can I actually find my yes? Can I actually find my no? I mean, that in itself is quite confronting.
Mm-hmm.
I can't find my no, I can't find my yes. wow,
Mhm.
there's something there that we need to do to come back into connection with ourselves.
Yeah, and it's quite fundamental. So for all of us, regardless of you know, well, in addition to our life experiences, for all of us, if we go all the way back to our infancy, as infants, stuff happened to us,
Mm.
whether we wanted it or not. We were picked up, we were put down, we were bathed, we were fed. Um, so all of these things were happening to us. And we had no ability to communicate whether we wanted it or not. And so we learn from infancy. Stuff happens, touch happens, life happens to us. And we just have to go along with it, whether we want it or not. So, this tendency to go along is deep in our nervous system, it is deep in our psyche, and it impacts us into adulthood.
Yeah.
For many, through our entire lives. And it's easier to let people tell us what to do, to go along with what's happening, rather than speak up and say, yes, I want that. No, I don't. Hey, I want something else. Can we do something else? What's going on here? Who's this for? What are we doing? Do I even want this? Like, the tendency to just allow things to happen is so ingrained in us that it actually takes a lot more effort to slow down and notice and choose. And that's also why this work is so important and why it makes such a difference and a fundamental shift in how we approach things when given the opportunity.
You know, as you're talking, I'm just thinking about the word compliance is with me. And it's like if you teach people how to disconnect from their bodies, then they're so much easier to control and to keep compliant.
Mhm,
Somebody who has access to their body information and who's aware of consent is a more challenging person to have around.
mhm,
They're going to speak out. They're going to stand up against things. They're going to um, be difficult and non-compliant.
mhm.
And so, by learning quite simply how to read this yes and no from your body, it's actually an act of revolution
It is. Mhm,
against the current culture and the
mhm,
current political systems and socioeconomic systems.
mhm.
I'm just going to like pause with that because it's like, it's huge.
Yeah. Yeah, and this is actually why I got into this work. I spent 20 years of my career working for a nonprofit, doing environmental work, and found myself burned out and noticed how much we were all doing and how little was changing.
Mm.
And what feels so important to me around this work of embodiment and consent and um, even sexuality. How do we reclaim these parts of ourselves that have been numbed, that have been silenced? Because the more we feel, the more compassionate we become toward ourselves, toward each other, toward our planet. If I can feel I can feel pain and joy and grief and anger in myself, then I become more compassionate to the pain and the grief that is happening around me. And it's harder to stay silent. It's harder to turn away from that. And we have to choose. We have to start to act, to do things differently. And we live in a system that does not function if people are speaking up and acting out.
I feel really compelled to say thank you to you for doing this work because of the enormity of the impact that it has.
Well, and thank you.
Because I know, like, within the kind of territory of transformational work, you know, consent, it's not considered to be kind of very glamorous or very sexy, you know, although I disagree with the sexy bit. Just like working with the nervous system, it's the same kind of like, it's not the kind of like, wow, we're doing these big explosive, like orgasmic experiences and razzmatazz. It's like we're working kind of like quietly in the background, but actually what's being brought forth is something that is counterculture and shifts dramatically the reality in which we can live. And it's sustainable. Unlike these big kind of like experiences that are kind of sold to us in other spaces. So it's like, you know, it's really foundational work and so essential that it's happening. So I want to kind of like put consent up there in neon flashing lights and really kind of speak into the importance of it. This is what we're doing here. You know, part of my passion, and as you know, is doing trauma-informed work. And, you know, consent is one of the threads within that work. But it's like we pull that thread and it's like, wow, there's so much here. So as somebody who's a facilitator, when they say, oh yeah, you know, I understand consent, yeah, we're doing consent, it's like, how far have you pulled on that thread to really get into the nitty-gritty, to really get into the nuts and bolts of consent, away from a kind of concept of consent and into an embodiment of consent? What would you say to people who kind of come with that approach, facilitators who say, yeah, well, I've kind of, you know, done enough on consent. I know consent. What would your response to that be?
That's a great question. And I do hear that, you know, yeah, I know consent. I do that. You know, I think I would start with curiosity of like what does it look like to you? What does it mean to you? How do you bring that in? What does that value mean to you? And I think coming back to, you know, how can you weave that throughout every piece of the work that you do? Like how I love that the image that you shared of pulling the thread. And you know, as I see this thread being pulled, I see all of these other pieces off of it kind of lifting. And I think, I feel so passionately about this piece. And if I could get anything across to people, it would be, how does this become a foundation to support all of these other beautiful threads that you have to offer? And seeing it as that foundation instead of here's a piece out here
Mm,
that we're going to talk about and then we're going to get to all this other stuff.
yeah.
Well, how do we integrate it so that it can hold all of these other beautiful pieces?
I first kind of came across the concept of embodied consent many years ago through Betty Martin's work, The Wheel of Consent. And, I remember at the time it was kind of like, it was big news for me. I hadn't come across a model which kind of explained consent in such a way. And everyone I knew around me who was a facilitator was like diving into it and really deeply exploring it. And yeah, I'm curious, like, where are you at with the Wheel of Consent as a model these days? Because I imagine it's kind of changed in some way since, I don't know, like 12 years ago when I first came across it. Like, what's the evolution been of that model, and how is it being taught now? How do you teach that now?
Hmm. So I was introduced to it about 10 years ago.
Mm,
And there are pieces of it that have remained the same. Like
mm,
at its core, it is so clear in bringing or in illuminating dynamics. This question of who's it for,
mm,
any interaction,
yeah,
and getting clear about who it's for, and that who it's for is different from who's being done to or who's doing the action. So we're so used to doing being ascribed to giving.
yes,
And
yes,
so the beautiful thing that the wheel takes apart is these two questions: who's
mm,
doing and who's for?
mm,
And that can combine in four different ways. So I could be doing for you, for your benefit, and I'm in service, where you are accepting that gift of my service. Or I could be doing for my own benefit.
mhm,
And in that case, I'm taking, and that's with your permission, and you're allowing me to do what I want and to access this gift of your time, your attention, your body, whatever the agreement is.
mm,
And so at a fundamental level, that's the essence of the wheel. I think what has changed over time is bringing in a lot more nuance
mm,
around these dynamics. So we talk a lot more about the influence of power dynamics,
mhm,
and how does the power dynamic influence our capacity to be a choice, our capacity to say yes or no. Is it safe to really be authentic in that because of the dynamic that's present? Um, and noticing the places where we aren't at choice. And that can be based on our social location. That can be based on whether or not we've had, if we're in a trauma response.
mm,
those experiences can take us out of choice. And you cannot be within the wheel of consent unless you are at choice.
Yeah.
And so looking at how these aspects of power and oppression play into our capacity to actually step inside the wheel and be in one of these dynamics with clarity, as well as noticing how those trauma responses take us out of choice and how easy it is to go along with things. Um, and so with all of that, the process comes back to slowing down, creating enough space, enough of a sense of safety and choice to be able to step in and have these experiences in an environment that feels safe enough. And then allowing people to step in and start to have these moments of, here's an experience where I get to be in personal choice. I get to have these few moments of feeling safe enough to have this experience that I want to have.
Yeah.
And so I think a lot of it is having more awareness of how our experiences, our lived experience, impacts our ability to actually even step into it. And moving a lot slower, bringing in more of these experiences of letting people first feel their body, feel their yes and no. We do a lot more before moving into any kind of touch. You know, it used to be that Betty would jump in as the first experience, you know, wake up your hands and then touch somebody else. And there's a lot more time and space to allow people to orient to their own body and to that sense of choice before engaging with any other body.
There's so much in what you've just shared, and I just want to kind of pull on one thread a little bit, which is, you know, you were talking about power, and I did an interview with Lex Rider a few days ago where they were talking about power in such an incredible way, and you know how we have different access to power, the power inequality that exists. And so I'm thinking about that, and I'm thinking about the nervous system at the same time. And, you know, when we have power inequality, what happens to our nervous system? Do we go into a fawning response? Do we go into a collapse response? Do we go into a more sympathetic response? I imagine a lot of people go into a fawning response when power shows up, when there's a power over dynamic. And it's like, what you're saying is that when that's in operation, choice is not available, so we cannot be in consent. And that's huge, because how much of our lives have we lived out of consent? How many relationships are we in or have been in where we're out of consent? But we're so wired to go along with, we're so wired to be compliant. And so what I'm aware of is that as we do this work, there's also this like devastation that happens when we realize how often we have overridden ourselves. There's a big piece of grief that needs to be met.
Yes.
And anger that we have been overriding ourselves and being overridden by others historically. So that's a lot of emotion that comes up into the mix when we finally kind of see what our relationship to consent has been like. And I guess this is like my last curiosity before we move on to talking about the free gift is that's a lot to hold in a space when people kind of have these realizations. And so what do facilitators from your perspective need to be aware of when they're moving into this territory of consent, knowing there's like a lot that can come up energetically and emotionally for people? Like, what do they need to do to prepare themselves for that eventuality or that possibility?
This is one of the responsibilities that we each have as facilitators, is to be doing our own work, our own trauma healing, our own racial healing, our own touch healing,
Mm.
and learning to receive. So a lot of the times when these experiences of grief come up, of anger coming up, is when people realize how much they have missed in receiving. And so, in order to better hold that, the more we step into our own work and our own experiences of touching that grief for ourselves, there's also the other side of that, which is compassion. And that those two parts, to me, it's a beautiful coming together. And so grief often emerges in the space as we're doing this work. As part of teaching the wheel of consent, we talk about what happens when we're out of consent, which we describe as the shadows, which is where most of us have operated most of our lives, to one degree or another.
Yeah.
Because we all have needs, we all have wants, we all have desires. And for most of us, we have not been taught how to ask for them, how to receive what it is we want, and how to take that in to our hearts. And we've developed all kinds of strategies to work around that. And we live in systems that are oppressive, which are operating outside of consent. And so we're all familiar with what it feels like to be outside of that.
Yeah.
And when we step into those experiences that are consensual, that's where the grief often comes up. And it's unfamiliar, and it brings up all of those experiences in our life when we didn't have that. And so, as facilitators, the more that we have touched on that for ourselves, the easier it becomes to hold that with compassion and love, and to not be afraid of big feelings being in the room. And so, doing our work around that and actively working on receiving. What are the ways that we can fill ourselves up so that we aren't going into those spaces depleted? And then when the feelings come up, it becomes much harder to hold and can actually trigger our own stuff. So I think that's one of the things that I emphasize a lot in the groups that I work with is practice receiving as much as possible. And it is a practice. It's not something we go and get a massage once and then it's like, okay, I'm good. It's like, how do we bring that into our lives as an ongoing practice? And that's going to provide us with more resilience, more groundedness, and more generosity.
Yeah, I just want to say this one last thing, which is, the ability to receive, it actually maps onto the nervous system. So there's like the ventral vagus state is the place where we're the most receptive. And it's the place where we're most open and loving and generous, as you describe. So what you're saying, there's neurological science that backs this up. And, the more that we can spend time in that place, the more that life generally tends to flow. And so as a facilitator, that becomes our safe harbor. We get to resource there, we get to fill ourselves up, we get to go out into the world, and then we can come back to that place and receive again. And so it kind of takes me full circle into many of the conversations that I've been having on the summit, which is really about, practitioners, facilitators, space holders, learning how to take care of themselves first before moving out and working with others, and making that the number one priority. And it's something that is often sort of seen as an optional extra. So I love the fact that you've just completely reinforced this. And we've come to the same point, but through a different lens. But it's like, here we are again. We need to take care of ourselves. And then we can be in service.
Yeah.
In a beautiful, wholehearted, generous, grounded way. Any last words that need to be spoken before we wrap this up?
I think that's a pretty good place to come to.
Yeah. So I'd love you to share with our audience the free gift that you're offering if people come and sign up to your list. What have you got in store for us?
Yeah, it's actually a free gift. You don't have to give me your email.
Oh.
So it's a free gift. And it's actually, it speaks to what we've just been talking about. So it's a touch meditation, which is one of the core practices in our teachings around the Wheel of Consent. A practice of waking up sensation in the hands. And it's a practice that helps you to feel more of yourself. It's a practice that supports grounding and resourcing. It's quite relaxing, brings your nervous system into a state of parasympathetic rest, rejuvenation. So it is a great tool to have in your toolbox if you are looking for ways to resource yourself.
Beautiful. Well, that is a perfect gift given where we ended our conversation. Oh, Robyn, thank you ever so much for being here and for having this conversation. It's been just, medicine to hear you talking about this topic, and I just want to honor and celebrate you because I know the depths that you've gone to professionally and personally within the realm of consent to be able to deliver the standard of care that you offer in your spaces.
Well, thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be with you.